Greetings and welcome to Nikos RPG. Pardon me, off to a great start. Welcome to Nikos RPG. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, and today we're going to take the opposite position we did last week. We were talking about the downsides of the long campaigns. Today we're going to talk about the merits of role-playing in the long form. We're, of course, having an ongoing conversation about role play because it's my estimation that you, yes, that's you in the seat right there, are a role player. You just don't know it yet because we've always been role players. So as we are going to go through this, I want you to consider all the times that you've ever been playful in your life that didn't have structure, didn't have boundaries. You just were being playful, and consider how much of that time you spent engaged in role play and perhaps hadn't even considered it. In particular, we're going to talk about how role-playing games can be benefits to the life that you're living in every other capacity of your existence. In this case, we're going to talk about the benefit of perspective. And I believe this is an area where our culture has kind of dropped the ball in terms of helping young folk. And I realize that I'm an old person. I'm in my 60s and have been and done all the things as a youngster that you would expect to have done. But the point here is that when we go through our lives, we have to develop the capacity to see through another person's eyes, to experience what others are experiencing, so that we can develop empathy and a better understanding of how to communicate. When we look at how we have processed our data in our lives, almost always we have a framework from which we have established our views. We have the things that we've read, the experiences that we've had, the personal experience we have. But it's a far different thing to actually consider what's going on in the mind of another without the ability to see perspective. The idea of taking the position of someone else and considering what that person is going through is integral in our ability to communicate, because we can start to understand how our viewpoint might be difficult to comprehend by someone else, and therefore we can learn how to push those ideas together into a bundle that each person can understand. Role-playing games do this in a demonstrative way, because you are taking on a role of a person in a story that isn't you. And while many people role play by simply visualizing what it is to wear other clothing and perhaps speak with a different voice, the idea of role-playing actually takes it a step further, where you're distancing yourself from your own personal perspective and trying to understand and act in the framework of another's perspective. Now, the question would be, what's the benefit? Well, the first benefit is that you actually can see possibilities and alternatives you may not have seen through your own eyes in other circumstances. This means that we can consider other directions, other possibilities, other options than we would have if we were only handling it within the framework of our own personal experience. A second thing that perspective provides is not only the ability to see another position, but to consider other variables than the ones under which we operate. As many people have recently been talking about issues like gender identity or political positioning based on their uh, privilege that's inherent to their birth conditions. Role playing lets you actually live in the space of another, at least vicariously and at least for the period of time that the game session applies. What I have found useful in particular is that by operating with this ability, with this capacity to consider other perspectives, is that you can be more circumspect about the decisions you make in your own life because you can be more aware of what other people might be thinking or might be considering. It's a far cry from actually reading other people's minds or forcing into their personality or their framework words that they haven't said or actions they haven't taken. But what it does do is provides a more open approach to this situation than would have been possible otherwise. There's also the merit of seeing other people in role play as well, because not only do you see your perspective change, but you can see how other people's perspectives and conditions and decisions might change as well. And this is really important because when we are talking with individuals, their position that they take, while initially will be to defend their current present condition, by having a conversation that is outside of that framework, you're able to see how their mind works and how their possibilities might fall other than you would expect. When we live our lives as it stands, unless we are given or granted or determine specific opportunities that are not in evidence, we pretty much are locked into that frame. We do not have in this world a absolutely solid capacity to change our position instantly. We can certainly endeavor to, we can certainly make changes to try to improve our the power in our relationship, the capacity for us to make decisions. Depends on it. But the idea of being empowered is something that happens instantly in an RPG and therefore gives us the immediate opportunity to look at the position differently. And in a role play environment, especially a fantasy setting or a fictional setting, we no longer have the fears that we are born with that prevent us from making these empowering changes, but instead we can simply decide to be in that position. And while taking or giving power in a fictional setting is not arguably overall productive, nonetheless, it does give us the perspective of understanding what goes on when people have those situations. For example, in a campaign, you might be put in charge of a group of individuals. You might be given a leadership role that you have not ever experienced before. Perhaps you'll be determining the course of actions for a small or large group of people. This level of empowerment lets your brain move into places that you haven't been before. There has been research, and I can't quote it, the actual details of it, but there are proofs out there that the actions that we take in our imagination influence our reality as well. I do know that they've talked about the fact that people's perspective and even in eyewitness accounts of things adapt and change over time as our memory and our imagination plays on those things that were factual. And I believe that it's also in the same case that if we role play empowerment, role play decision making, we develop the skills in those areas that will translate as well when we internalize them. And it's very important that role play is not just a situation of putting a piece on a board that represents a leader and saying that's a leader. Instead, we have to consider and make actions and decisions for that persona as if we were that person. And by doing so, we develop for ourselves better skills in making decisions. And I think empowerment in a role play environment sheds really solid effect in real life. I know of people who, in after years of role playing, go to their place of occupation and request changes in their position that would give them better leadership, better command, better agency, better empowerment. And because they have experienced the improvements in the game environment, their brains are already prepared for those changes. Dr. Chrissy Mackey did her doctorate on the very merits of Dungeons and Dragons, in particular on the workforce, and established in her thesis that people who play role-playing games have decidedly improved social outcomes in their actual lives. You can check with Dr. Mackey. I'll put her contact information below, but and perhaps direction to find her thesis. But the point of that is that when we allow ourselves in game to take on leadership roles and then start to consider the actions that such a person would be required to take, the kinds of terminologies they would need to develop, we find ourselves developing those very things in our actual life, which of course means that our output in life improves over time. That I guess I would not go so far as to say that a role-playing environment or a role-playing game will necessarily make you a better leader, but if you take advantage of the positions in game that allow you to make changes in the world, then you can see perhaps some means by which you can actually do that in the real world as well. A third area of this is agency. And while it seems or might seem to have a parallel with empowerment, the idea here of agency is that we have limitations in the real world. Here on terra firma, I'm never going to run a 4-minute mile. I'm never going to climb Mount Everest. Those are just things that were not priorities in my youth that led me in that direction. So on the other hand, if I want to perceive myself or play a character who has those capacities, I certainly can do that. And the idea of agency in the game, especially if it's an internalized role-playing environment where the player is experiencing the joy and the trepidation and the danger involved with real actions in their game, then they are able to develop a healthier understanding of what that would be. I've used this example before. I have a player in our group. His online handle is Abletop, and he's paraplegic. He has difficulty moving around, and he has functional use of basically one of his arms. It's muscular neurological issues that have made it so that's the case. But he has developed persona that were agile, that were able to run at a high rate of speed. They could do parkour, and the ability to send our mind into a place where we actually have those capacities allow us to experience life in ways that perhaps we would never otherwise be able to. And literally puts, pardon me, it literally puts our existence on a new plane because we are now able to feel the wind running through our hair. We can, the breeze on our face. We can understand the exhaustion that can occur from overexertion, and the difficulties and challenges that we can face in game allow us to experience life in many ways that we would never otherwise be able to. I know there was recent research done on the mind that validated that if we have experienced something in a fictional setting and internalized it, we then actually have some of the outcome of the physical exertion. In other words, we may not, develop the level of serotonin and emotional elation from succeeding at a race course or whatever. Nonetheless, in game, we can feel the satisfaction of it, and therefore experience vicariously that which was there. And arguably, that memory can be modified and adapted over time to where we actually believe that we have accomplished some of those things. I don't mean in a fictional recreation way, but just that we tangibly feel like we ran up that hill and defeated that monster and all of that. This goes back to a time when I was younger, when the thought was that people who played role-playing games were antisocial or incapable of socialization, or were loners and dissociative, and all the other terms that you could talk to about a person being non-social, because it was perceived that the role-playing community were isolated, that because they were in that fringe of fictional space, they were not able to socially interact. As a matter of fact, the tropes that you see in shows like Big Bang or Community that talk about role-playing games, and Dungeons and Dragons in particular, really do push them into this small box of socially distorted capacities. But the reality is that, at least in my experience, being a person who moved as often as I did, as I've said before, I moved 40 times before I was 18. I went to 22 different grade schools and 6 different high schools across 11 different states. And that process of getting around in my life caused me to be a socialized individual as well as a gamer. And therefore, I kind of broke the mold in terms of what people thought role-playing was. And ironically, or not really ironically, perhaps because of that, I was able to reach a larger role-playing audience than otherwise possible. I was just as likely to run a group full of, football jocks as I was a group full of, mathematics nerds. So the veneer that somehow says role-playing is antisocial or unuseful is a misnomer, and I would argue instead it develops the very critical communication skills in a safe space, so that the individual can become a productive part of social fabric over time. It may be true that the initial allure of the isolated small group dynamic that is role-playing might be a draw for those who have social anxiety issues. But my experience has been, instead of isolating and protecting and coddling, it has caused players to learn to engage, learn to embrace the challenges they have in life, and have given them an avenue to straight out practice those mechanical skills. And therefore, this is not a game for the socially inadequate or the socially distant. Instead, it's for anyone who wants to improve their social identity and their social connection. It doesn't happen in a microcosm. Yes, it's certainly true that high school groups can be cruel, but that has more to do with the age of the individuals playing than it does the actual mechanics by which they are playing. And so when we look at role playing, I would like you to consider, at least for the time of this video, that this is actually your story as well. That the fiction that we create in a role playing environment is a functional, safe space by which you can develop your social skills. This means things like following instruction and learning to take your turn, sharing communication information, learning the gives and takes of public speaking. Even on the micro scale, players inevitably are put in a position where they are the star of the scene, and it's up to them to carry out the promotion and production of the very action of the game. So with that being the case, therefore, a person who is put in a position to monologue learns to monologue and learns to present information in a more coherent fashion. And to a larger extent, and I may actually have a separate video, separate screen for this, but in another way, it makes it a very safe environment, an encouraging environment. As a matter of fact, I know I've got another slide on it coming up. The element here that I'm trying to get across is that since the story is now not just exclusive, talking about those other people that role play, this is talking about our experience. When I was a child, of course, there were a lot of different ways of educating. And one of the things that happened in high schools, and this is probably still the case, there were drama clubs. And drama clubs gave you a place to role play, to actually act in, staged events for school. And there's more pressure, arguably, there because you're standing in front of instead of a group of 4 or 5, you're standing in front of a group of 200. And there's merits to both, because in both cases, you have people who are really encouraging you and want you to succeed. But in a smaller group dynamic, you're able to get that feedback more directly. You can learn. People will give you recommendations on what you might do differently in the future elements. But the point is that you get the chance to make that attempt without judgment, without someone criticizing or taking away from your capability. So the story is as much yours as it is the game master. In addition to this, of course, there is, I started to talk about it a bit, the idea of learning the very merits of gameplay. And all games provide some educational merit. It's just a matter of determining which game style promotes which method of communication you want to use. So the idea of waiting your turn, considering your options while other people are making their choices. These are all things that are natural and are part of general gamesmanship. The idea of acknowledging a source other than yourself itself, that on its own is a critical part of communications, because when we are, for example, going to a public court scene, we're going to be interacting differently than we would if we were in a social environment. And the vocabulary is going to change, the protocols are going to change, and having these, even in an emulated way in a role-playing environment, give us a chance to experience some of that, even if we've never actually had to be in that position. And by doing this, we're building up a repertoire of skills that we can use in our communication with others, and therefore improves our individual lives on just sheer the merits of understanding how games work. The subject of socialization has been a kind of a buzzword in the back of my mind for decades. The idea that somehow a person who is let's say, a numeric genius. They've done math when they were little, and they're really good at understanding how maths work and how to engage with other people in educational ways is first class, but their capacity to carry on a conversation in real life or in face-to-face connection with human beings has suffered. Well, I would argue that socialization through conversation is really the watchword of role-playing games. And if there are challenges with, for example, utilizing ye old English, the concept of using terminology that would fit a genre that would not fit in publicly social interaction, I believe that's overcome by the fact that there is so much conversation in games that are not within the framework. And by realizing that we can learn to communicate by communicating, game systems that do this, such as role playing, depend on your ability to communicate. So they actually arguably create better communicators. Many of the motion picture stars of today, like I'm using that word way old fashioned, the movie business, people like Vin Diesel and Shia LaBeouf and others that role play games on a regular basis are unashamed of it, and there's no reason to be ashamed of it, because it is a means by which they were able to practice the very skills that now make them a living. And while socialization in such a regimented way as motion movies and television might be a far cry from where you are thinking you are going to be in your current life, the idea is that your ability to communicate transcends all occupational paths, and you set yourself up for greater success simply by learning visual cues, socialization cues, proper dialogue mechanisms, and that it comes out in spades in role-play games, and therefore provides us with the ability to make changes in the world through our own lives by learning how better to converse. And here's where I was speaking in particular about how socialization in role-playing improves your output. The idea is that we as a group of players, whether you're talking a small group of 3 or 4 or a larger group of 16 to 20, or even in my case running hundreds of people in the same game at the same time, players learn to feel comfortable by engaging in front of witnesses, in front of other people. And the encouragement through this dynamic of audience also provides the players with an ongoing understanding and appreciation of their own skills in doing so. And as they practice in front of small groups, they become more confident about doing so in larger groups. I know of a couple of individuals who in their life before role playing had been involved in very menial, very low paid occupations, but by the time they finished playing with our group, half a dozen years later, pardon me, they not only were capable but were apt to be the ones communicating and conversing and expressing in front of audiences, and got improved income, got improved positions because their own perspective of their capacities had improved through the actual role play. And I encourage, if you've never played a role play game, for you to join a group, even if it's one of mine, to get a chance to interact and become the star of your own community. And by doing so, you become a better, more productive member of your social community as well. As my grandfather used to say, there are more things that we could talk about than we can shake a stick at. And I always thought that was a strange phrase. But the idea here is I'm going to talk about some areas that we might shake a stick at when it comes to your experience in a role-playing game. If you have been a role player and you go to an interview, the very interview itself is a role-playing environment. You are portraying yourself as someone that the community that is hiring is looking for. And so therefore, the more accurately you can portray yourself as someone who fits that bill, the more likely you are to get that occupation. If you are looking at your daily work, even in a job you already have right now, if you have constantly been a person who goes to work, does your job, and comes home and you don't socially interact with the other people at work, you're failing yourself in terms of building up new experiences in role play, because you take on the role of a communicator and present the information of your life to them in such a way that it's engaging, entertaining, and enlightening, and they're going to reciprocate and provide you with more opportunities. It's a constant adjustment of what you are trying to accomplish, simply by constantly looking at what it is that you have done in the past and seeing, therefore, what is now possible for you beyond that. And whether you're shaking a stick at options or you're actually heavily weighing what you might do, realize that a role-playing game, regardless of its genre, provides you with the imagination building, the concept of problem solving, and situational analysis that will make you a better person overall, because you'll be more aware of what's possible. And the more that is possible in your world, the more likely you will find those things that you are looking for right there in your own environment. Alrighty, we are complete with the information I wanted to cover today. I want to thank you for being here today. I hope to see you in the next episode. Remember, we record Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m., and we will talk to you later today.